I think it
And
was already, yeah, yeah.
we've just started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are really honored to have Tony and Nick. Well, I've just discovered that we have a teacher who's proud of his student. We have this teacher and the student, and we are really happy to have you both. Tony, I've been since Nick introduced you to me. I've been reading about your works, about your writing, and I don't know how to introduce you because honestly, it feels like everything you wrote was award-winning. So I can say an award-winning writer. Honestly, an award-winning winning writer and author, an academic, an activist. And we're really proud to have you. Thank you so much for dedicating this time to
Oh,
talk to our
thank you for
students
having me.
and to
It's a
share
real
your
honor to be here.
experience. Thank you so much. So we are glad to have you. And thanks, Nick, for making this connection and um, sharing the time again with us. And it's wonderful to have you again. So I'll leave the floor for the proud teacher and the proud student. So we think about the craft of writing and storytelling. Over to you,
Yeah, it's
Tony and Nick. Thank you so much.
well, it's a great honor, Ahmed. Thank you so much for having us. Um, is there anything that you wanted to say before we got started, Tony?
Well, I just want to say the same as you. It is a real honor. I think for people in Gaza, just something I've been. So I'm a member of APAM, which is the Australian Palestinian Association Network. Um, and during the war, there I've spoken at some of the important gatherings here in Melbourne in Australia. But one of the things that I felt very important to me was not to talk too much, but to listen and follow um, what I was being taught by Palestinian people here in Melbourne and globally, and the people of Gaza generally. So the other thing I wanted to make sure I did was to contribute to, I suppose, people's well-being and contribute in any way I can as a teacher. And I feel really grateful to Nick actually for inviting me to present tonight. I just think it's a real great opportunity for me to engage with people in Gaza, and I feel really honored to be here.
Thank you
Yeah, it's
so
a real. Um, well, I guess we should probably just jump into it. And
Yeah.
before we start, just to say that at any point, if anybody wants to jump in, as Tony said, it's really important for us to hear what you have to say about the work too. And on really anything that we're talking about, feel free to jump in the chat or put your hand up. We welcome as much conversation as possible. That being said, I recognize that you guys don't have the best bandwidth right now, that the devices that you're using often don't have a lot of power. So we understand you might be jumping in and out through the session and that you might not be able to say anything even though you want to. And so we'll put our emails in the chat at the end. So please do reach out if you'd like to. And we've got some writing exercises based around each of the stories that we're going to talk about today. And you can also feel free to complete those exercises in your own time and send either me or Tony your work or both of us. And I'm sure we would love to give you feedback. I haven't actually asked Tony yet about that, but I'm sure he would agree
That'd be
that it
fun,
would
of
be
course.
amazing to be in contact with you about your writing and about Tony's work as well. So yeah, we should definitely just get started. Basically, we thought we would talk about each of the stories. There's about 5 stories that have been sent around. Hopefully, we'll get to talk to at least 4 of them. We're thinking about doing it in a sort of almost like a question and answer format, where I've prepared some questions about about some of the elements of the craft of Tony's writing and his process for each story. So we'll chat a little bit, leave room for questions if anyone has capacity to answer them, and then talk about the writing exercise. And just also a little bit of time for Tony to read each of the stories, because if you didn't get a chance to get to them, I'm sure you would like to hear them before we start talking about them. So I thought we could start with the bicycle thieves. And for anyone who didn't get the stories, this is from Tony's most recent collection. And as Ahmed said, is an award-winning writer, but also a very prolific writer. I think probably the most prolific writer that I know. This is this maybe the 7th book or something, Tony, that's come
No,
out?
the 12th.
the 12th book, and it's always been extremely quality work, and it's always amazing to see a Tony Birch title out on the streets. And this is the most recent one, which is the collected stories, which spans over 30 years of short story writing. Is that right, Tony?
20. I've only
20.
been publishing for, I've only been publishing for 20 years in book form. So I always say to people it's never too late because I didn't publish my first book until I was 48. 48, yeah.
Really?
So I'm 68 now, so I've been publishing for 20 years. I
You've been
didn't
making
write.
up for lost time, though, Tony, because that's an unbelievable output. I didn't realize
Oh,
that. But
I
anyway,
don't think it
okay.
was. The time before that wasn't lost. Years of juvenile delinquency. Working in hospitals, working as cleaners. I mean, it's all material, Nick. I wasn't wasting my time.
No, of course not. All right, well, let's get into it. So, yeah, let's start with the bicycle thieves, Tony. Maybe you could read just from the beginning of the story, just the first few pages, and then maybe give us a little bit of a synopsis, and then we can jump
Yeah,
into it. Or I'm happy
yeah.
to if you.
Well, I'll just read the first couple of pages.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I've got the numbers here too. I think it's 325 to 327.
Yeah, I've got them too.
Yeah, good.
Jack Garrett rode a bike to work for over 30 years. He laid hot mix with a road crew from the local council, and his skin had been permanently baked, leaving him with a face of a battered football. Roadwork was thirsty, summer and winter. Jack would go to the pub once he knocked off for the day, and a couple of hours later, he'd set his old black bike to autopilot and let it guide him home. The day after he retired from the council, he walked the bike down the street to our house and knocked on the door. Is your mum in? He asked. Nope, she's on afternoon shift. The old bike was resting against a light pole in the street. See this bike? I don't have a use for it anymore, he said. It might look fucked, but it's not. Jack liked to swear when he spoke for no particular reason, which annoyed my mother. The bicycle was held together with rusty wire and old rope. I didn't want it, but didn't have the courage to say so. Leave it here, I said on the veranda. I'll have to ask Mum when she gets in. When Mum didn't approve of Jack, while Mum didn't approve of Jack's foul language, she told me I could show gratitude to him and accept the generous offer of the bike. I'm not riding that bike, Mum, I told her. You'll accept the bike and you'll ride it, she ordered. I'm not doing it. I'll be laughed at. She wouldn't hear of it. All you need to do is ride the bike up and down the street now and then so Jack can see that his bike has been put to use. The bike weighed a ton. Jack had attached a metal crate to the pack rack to help carry his work bag and bottles of beer. It added further weight to the machine that could well have been made of cast iron. I did as my mother told me and rode the bike out on the street anytime I saw Jack out the front of his place, seated on a wooden chair and nursing a glass of beer. He would wave at me, I'd wave back, and he seemed happy enough. I'd no intention of riding the bike any further than the end of the street until the morning I was about to mount it, and my younger brother Pat, who'd been watching me closely from the footpath, came and stood in front of the bike and took hold of the front wheel. What are you doing? I asked. Move, or I'll ride over the top of you. I want to come on the bike, he said. I'm not going anywhere, just to the bottom of the street and back. Okay, so the impetus for this story is pretty clear and it's pretty straightforward. So my younger brother, and just to show you the cover of the book here, there's my younger brother Wayne and my little sister Tracy. This photograph is about 55 years old. My younger brother died very suddenly about 6 years ago. And when we were at his funeral, there were photographs of my brother, particularly from childhood. And I remembered in one of the photographs, he was sitting across a brand new push bike that he'd been given as a present as a 10-year-old boy. And at the time that he got the bike, we were all really jealous. So we were quite a big family, and we had never been given anything of that wealth or value. But my brother was spoiled by my dad, so he bought him this brand new dragster bike, and we were very jealous of him getting the bike. But then about 2 years later, the bicycle was stolen off our front veranda by a local kid, and my brother was really shattered by that experience. So two of the things that I did after my brother died, I wrote this story, Bicycle Thieves, about two brothers and one of a brother losing his beautiful bike and his older brother tracking down the thieves who stole the bike. But additionally to that, Nick, people obviously won't know is that I had his bike completely rebuilt about 5 years ago from a vintage cycle maker in Melbourne. So we found an original dragster frame, a very old frame that we had remodeled, and I had a whole new bike built that replicated his old bike, and I rode it to my mum's house on Christmas Day, which is I looked like a bear on on a circus bike or something, and I got everyone in the family to sit on the bicycle and have their photograph taken. So it was a story that really started as a tribute to my younger brother, but also about how an older brother he loves his younger brother so deeply, and when the bike is stolen, he's determined to get the bike back, even though it costs him greatly, in the sense that he gets beaten up quite badly in the story.
Yeah, that kind of like segues quite nicely to the first question I wanted to ask you, Tony, which is, it's like you looking at your kind of oeuvre, as they say, it's like you have a tendency to write about characters or want to write about characters that are very, I guess, kind of complex, who don't always do the right things, who more often than not will do the wrong things. And it's not as if your work ever moralizes them. I mean, I think it's like part of what's so great about your fiction is how generous you are to all of your characters. But it's like it strikes me that this story is quite unique because the characters are so good. Like they are so kind and loving to each other. It's like the mother who saves up to buy a bicycle that she can't afford just to see the look on her kid's face. It's like the brother who will do everything he can to protect his younger brother. I mean, the older brother, who's like, he's probably what, like maybe 12 or 13 is kind of how old I think he is, right?
Yeah.
It's like when I was 12 or 13, the last thing I'd want to do with my holidays is ride my younger brother around on like a beaten up bicycle. I'd want to hang out with my friends. And he seems quite street smart, this kid. It's not as if he doesn't have friends of his own, but he's just so committed to having a really beautiful relationship with his brother. So I was wondering what drew you at this point in your career towards wanting to write a story about such a happy, good family that is like, I guess, like the perfect family in a way.
Well, firstly, I think that you've now given me an understanding of why you have such a troubled relationship with your younger brother, Nick, the furniture maker. I can see where this starts. So I think you're right. There are several clear reasons. One is it's called The Bicycle Thieves for obvious reasons, which is
Mm,
named after the very famous Italian neo-realist film made just after the Second World War. And it's about a father and son. But in that film, it's about the shock of a father losing his bike, having it stolen, which is his
mm,
livelihood, and then seeing the son, seeing his own father attempt to steal a bike, which is deeply, deeply troubling. So I did want to deal with the morality of stealing a bicycle. So in other words, when I was a kid, if you had a bicycle, it's hard to explain how much that would be valued because
mm,
we didn't have enough money to buy bicycles. So if you had a bicycle, it was a treasure. If you had a bicycle, even as a kid, you could get work as a paper boy. You could get work picking up scrap metal. You could get all sorts of paid work. So a bicycle wasn't a toy. It wasn't like a sports. Yeah, you weren't going in the Tour de France. You were working. So that having a bicycle was very important. I think the other thing that you are so accurate about, it is a clear story where I did want to privilege a relationship between two brothers because of how much I love my brother. So it is a deliberate story to convey a story of love between two brothers because I wanted to tell a story of love between myself and my younger brother. And thirdly, I think this is generally about my work is that, sometimes people find my work abrasive or gritty, and sometimes there is violence in my work, as you will know. When I don't do that, um, part of it is to give myself a break in the sense that
mm,
I'm often dealing with situations where, I want to be able to convey love between characters rather than always having to get stuck with the story where there is tragedy, I suppose.
mm. Yeah, that is interesting. Like the idea that even just as a writer, it's just nice to be able to open up to explore a world in which things just kind of go right for once. and that
Yeah.
the kid that the family's love for each other does like is strong enough, and does last. But there was something that I was interested in too, is because there's two intertexts in this movie, right? And it's like that phrase intertext refers, for anyone who doesn't know it, it's when art refers to other art to create a conversation. So that you sort of almost need to know the work that's being referenced to be able to fully understand what the original work is trying to do. So the Bicycle Thieves is definitely one, and that's like a kind of an interesting relationship because it's from that kind of Italian neo-realist period in the 40s and talking about, films that were done after the Second World War in war-torn Italy. And they do have that very gritty, hyper-realist element, which is makes it like a natural kind of counterpart, I guess, to your fiction.
Mm.
But there's another intertext in there, which is Harvey, which is a Jimmy Stewart film from the early 50s about a man who thinks that he can see a bunny rabbit. And it's a bit of a screwball comedy. It's a bit fantastical. It's very light, very classic Hollywood and of that period. And I was wondering why it was important for you to put both of those texts into this story. Why one that's
Well,
quite gritty
yeah.
and one that's quite fantastical and sweet. And the family goes and sees the movie together.
Well, firstly, I've been obsessed with both the films, so to put them together was a nice experiment for me. The reason I love Harvey is the film, and I used it. I actually referenced that film in a story called Father's Day about 15 years ago as well. And like you, I get your point where you say it's magical, but the only thing I would say in sort of disagreement. Someone has their microphone off. The only thing I'd say in disagreement with that is that from the perspective of the boy who believes that the rabbit is real, I go with that. So
Mm,
I don't know, I don't accept your idea that he imagines the rabbit. He does, the
mm.
rabbit is there, the giant rabbit is there. So the boy who doubts the rabbit and then the young boy who can see the rabbit, I go with the young boy. So clearly the magic is what matters to me. And in this story, it's why that notion of the boy who he get, even though the bike is wrecked, he brings his brother's bicycle home. And it's a bit like you talking about this. I mean, I think you're describing them as a perfect family is very generous, but I get the point of, that with a happy ending. I did want to write a story that in the most difficult circumstances that magic is real and it's not romanticized or it's not fanciful. So yeah, to be honest, of course it's fanciful to think about a giant rabbit, but within the context of the story, those who believe that a giant rabbit is real have a much better opportunity to get through difficulty than those who doubt that the rabbit is real.
Yeah. See, what's so fascinating to me about that is that it does like what's interesting to me about this story is when you're reading it. So for people who, well, obviously for everyone in the room almost who's in Gaza, it's like the setting is not going to make that much sense to you. But for someone who lives in Melbourne, it's like this is a story about people who live in council housing in, is it the 60s,
Yeah,
Tony? In the
yeah,
60s?
it's set in the 60s. But again, we can't do it tonight. My sense would be that it would be the same if I read a story set in Gaza. I mean, obviously I have images, terrible images of Gaza through the media, but let's say you set it in a local neighborhood of Gaza that I have no insight into. To me as a reader, that doesn't matter. And the fact that if the story works, it would be the same qualities of, so if it was two siblings in Gaza in a neighborhood, if it was something about a child in Gaza who had something stolen and an older sibling, heroically retrieved it. I get that. I'm not gonna the geography I think is and I know people say I'm very much a Melbourne writer, but when I say the geography is overstated, it is a bit of a contradiction because I do like to write very local. But I do think that storytelling does transcend locality. And while
Mm,
sometimes I'll read a story and I'm uncertain of setting because even the best writers technically, if you don't know have no sense of the place, your vision of the place might be impressionistic at best. I don't think that matters. So that I think that people who like this story are not going to puzzle over, oh, I wonder what Melbourne's like. I think they will. I think what they will get is that, hey, this brother, he had his bicycle stolen, and his brother's going to get it back. Now, I think
Yeah.
any kid's going to know that, and I think, clearly, what God, what people have to go through in Gaza, I think they will get this. I think they would really
Hmm.
get it.
Well,
Yeah,
we might ask what people thought of it if they had a chance to read it in a sec. But I
only if
guess
they
kind of
like it.
if they liked it. But I guess my point was more like if you know this area well, you know how much, and this already comes through in the story, but how much is stacked against this family in a way.
Yeah.
And right, and it's like this is a very working class family. It's like one thing that they're concerned about is being abducted by the state. If their mother who loves them more than anything in the world and does everything for them is seen to not be taking care of them properly in the eyes of a state that in a way would want to take these kids away. So it's like there's a lot going on. And you as a reader know this. So you're expecting bad things to happen. And it's
Hmm.
like what you get is a kind of a happy, like a kind of a happy ending in a way. It's kind of dark because this kid, the brother, defends his younger brother and gets the bike back, even if it's destroyed. But there's still a kind of innocence about it, which is kind of interesting to think about those two films that you've drawn in to the story.
Mm.
One, the hyper-realist story from the post-war, and then this other story that's kind of a bit sort of fantastical and imaginary and about believing in the innocence and the possibility of this bunny. Seems like that captures something about what this story is trying to do. And I thought we might want to just very quickly talk about the ending and why it is that you wanted to end it there, where
How did I
the
end it?
brother.
How did I end it?
How did you? So the older brother.
Tell me
Um,
what happens.
so what happens for everyone who hasn't read it is that the younger brother is like the older. They have the bike get stolen. These two brothers go and get the bicycle, and
Yeah,
somehow they manage to kind of get out of a situation with some very nasty kids from the
yeah,
estates, which
yeah,
I right, and then
yeah. The
despite the
brother
fact
goes
they get the
back.
bike back,
Yeah,
the kids from the estate come back and
yeah,
they beat up the younger brother and destroy the bicycle.
yeah.
And then the older brother is so angry about that and doesn't want his younger brother to think that something as unjust as this could happen without any consequences, goes out, finds those boys, and has a fight with them, gets beaten up, but obviously hurts them pretty bad as well. And there's this
Mhm.
strange sense of justice. And what's
Where's
interesting
that
about the
train?
story is that the younger boy, everybody is obsessed with saving Pat's innocence. It's like
Yeah,
the mother wants to keep his innocence, the brother wants to keep his innocence. They've had an
yeah,
abusive father who's disappeared. And it's almost like the whole family and everyone in the neighborhood is committed to keeping this kid's childhood a childhood, despite
yeah,
all of the difficulties surrounding them. And
yeah.
yet, how the innocence is saved at the end is by his brother getting into a horrible fight. And
Well,
I was just wondering why you wanted to leave it there.
okay, look, for the people in the room, this is what you need to understand is Nick grew up in the suburbs, in the sedate suburbs of Melbourne, where no one would steal a bicycle and no one would dare go and get beaten up for the sake of it. So Nick is a bit puzzled, but for the rest of us, I'm sure you'll get this. It is about what I call, I grew up in a time where summary justice was everything. So if you
Mm,
wanted to get justice for a wrong, so if your brother was beaten up, if his bicycle was stolen, if your mother was suffered domestic violence at the hand of a man, her husband, like in my case with my father, the only justice you got was if you went to seek justice yourself. The police would never help you.
mm,
There was no one in authority who would say, "Hey, that kid shouldn't take your bicycle. You'll have it back." If you went to the police, they would ignore you. So if you want to get your bicycle back, or if you want to say, "Okay, my brother's been beaten up. These these boys have to suffer a punishment," well, it's up to you to do it. Now, in an alternate universe, Nick, the older brother could say, "Okay, I'm really sorry to his younger brother that you were beaten up, but there's nothing we can do about it." They just don't live that way. They live in, so when I grew up in that era, there is no way that anything would, like, happen where you wouldn't think that, you had to respond. And if you didn't respond, well, you would be beaten up again. And
Mm,
there is a moral here that relates to real life, and it may not be the best. I wouldn't give this advice to my children and grandchildren who live in sedate suburbs. Is that my father taught me when I was a child, because I used to box. I was a very good boxer, and he would say, if you fight an older boy in the street, even if he beats you, as in beat you, as long as you fight back and hurt that boy, he won't come back a second time. So that sounds like terrible advice for a father to give a son, but it worked because
mm,
it's the way I grew up. And I mean, I wouldn't have wanted my children or my grandchildren to grow up that way, but when I grew up in Fitzroy in the 60s, it made sense. It was a very, very tough place to live. And I think some people in your audience would understand that. You
mm.
don't.
No, I not only do I understand it, Tony, I think that
Okay.
it's an amazing part of the story because there is
Mm,
something, it's a beautiful how, in a way, the innocence of this child is protected by his older brother going
mm.
knowingly into a fight he's going to lose. And there's
Yeah,
something about that that feels so true and beautiful, and is such a
well,
powerful ending to the
I
story.
can show you the photograph again. Look at my younger brother. He is just so beautiful. And he
Yes.
was, I mean, he was
Yeah.
incredibly beautiful. And he
Mm,
was in our family, he was incredibly innocent. I never knew my brother to get it. Like he never got into a fist fight in his whole life. In his whole life. He was a
mm,
beautiful, sweet boy. I wasn't. So that in a sense that my role in our relationship, but having said that, and I think we should bring gender into this. This is not simply, well, I'm not suggesting you're saying it's not a masculinist thing. The best fighter in my street was my older sister. My
mm,
older sister was the best boxer in our street. And I've said this, my sister is 70 years old. She's a lifelong career nurse. She was my protector. So like in
mm,
the story, the older brother protects the younger brother, my older sister protected me in the street. So everyone mattered in that way.
mm. We
Maybe we
should
should
move
move on to the next story though. Do you
should
think we're
move on
running out
to
of
the
time?
next story because the writing exercise that that Tony's prepared is actually kind of for two stories. And what's so
Yes.
interesting about them, especially considering what we're talking about, is the second story, Gifted, also centers the relationship between two brothers, but the tone and style and I guess ultimate kind of impact of the story is completely different.
Yeah.
So I reckon we should talk about Gifted now. Um,
Yeah.
Tony, do
Did
you
you
want to
have
give a bit, pardon?
context?
Yeah, would you like to give a bit of a synopsis? I'm happy to do it if you want, but I think it'd
No,
be great if you could tell us a bit about this story and particularly
yeah.
why you wanted to center this particular encounter
Okay.
between
So for writing students in the audience, it's one of those ones where I can actually point to the seed for this story is based on an observation. And one of the things I often say to students is the observational work you do as a writer is vital. So if you see something that really grabs your attention, you can't shake it, you write it down in your journal. It's remarkable how that will come back to you and might be the beginning of a story. The beginning of this story was when I was walking along the street one day near my brother's house, and I don't know if you would have these in Gaza, but in Melbourne, a lot of people have on their letterboxes no junk mail. So, junk mail being the sort of advertising material you
Mm,
get from department stores and, yeah, basically people selling stuff. So, yeah, my mum, for instance, she loves junk mail. She couldn't get enough junk mail, but some people have no junk mail. And I saw this guy taking everyone's junk mail out of their letterboxes and putting it in a big bag. And then when I followed him around the street and he went to his flat, there were just these massive plastic bags, like about 20 of them, full of junk mail. And I just started to think about why would anyone want to collect junk mail and what might they do with it? And then I was just thinking about it for a while, and I thought, well, yeah, he could, what would he do with the paper? And then I had this idea that he melted all the junk mail paper down to paper mache, and then he made model cars. And that was all of the story. And then started to think, why would he do that? So then that led me to think about a story where one brother sees his younger brother, although they're both adults, as problematic because the younger brother is very withdrawn. He's clearly suffering some form of psychiatric illness. He doesn't seem someone who wants to communicate or be part of a community. But what you discover through the story is the younger brother has a great sense of generosity, because what he does is he makes these beautiful model cars and he returns a model car to every letterbox that he took the junk mail from. So the notion of the story, it is about generosity, and it's about someone taking junk or rubbish and turning it into something of value. So it's the ultimate recycling story, Nick. So it's very early. This is a very old story, by the way. It's one of my first
Mm,
stories, and I love the story. I loved writing it. I do like to read this story. It's a quiet story.
mm.
Um, there's a nice relationship with this sort of whimsical girl upstairs who pokes her head over the balcony. And again, it's based on the architecture of a public housing estate that my brother
Mm.
lived on in well, not that it matters to people in inner Melbourne, but it's about, again, a very nominally poor community, and about this man who shows his generosity to his neighbors by making art.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like I have quite a different reading of this story, but I
What you do,
also
Nick?
what I would like if we could read a bit. What do you think, Tony? I mean, like maybe this is I'm kind of pushing my own reading onto the story via what I've chosen, but would you
You
be able
are.
to read from page 178? It's particularly the encounter between these two brothers. And the older brother, Tony hasn't mentioned this, but he resents having to visit his younger brother who's mentally ill.
So
It's kind of one
two,
of his least, yeah, yeah, just 2 pages from 178 to
yeah,
180. And it's his brother's
okay.
birthday, and so he has to see him and he has to bring him a gift, and he's trying to get that over and done with. So he gives the brother the gift, and so this is what happens.
Water dripped from his hair and clothing down his legs onto his feet before running under the soles of his sandals onto the threadbare carpet. Get a towel, Ray, and dry yourself off. I tried ordering him. Change your wet clothes, you'll catch a cold or something. Preoccupied with thoughts of his own, he ignored me. Have you got any change? He said, holding out one hand. Change for what, Ray? Just change. What do you mean, just change? Money, you mean? You want money or something? No, change for the plate. The plate? What plate? Unsure of what he was talking about, I looked around for a plate. He closely watched me as he clenched his hands together. The plate, he tried explaining, obviously frustrated by what he regarded as my stupidity. For the church, the donation. I suddenly realized what he was talking about, but now it was my turn to ignore the question. I handed him the gift. Happy birthday, Ray. He nursed the gift in his hands as he gently massaged the wrapping paper with the inside of his thumbs. Colours, he said. Yet again, I had no idea what he was talking about. What? Colours, he said, holding up the gift. Don't just look at it, Ray. Open it up. The present, it's for you. He ripped the parcel apart and glanced at the t-shirts before dumping them on the couch. He held the gift paper in his hands. I felt around in the side pocket of my jacket for his birthday card. Here, I got the kids to sign it. Josh drew a picture of himself in the back of the card for you. Here, have a look. He let the wrapping paper fall to the ground as he snatched the envelope from me. He held it in his hand, running his fingers across its parchment surface, and the 6-year-old scripted, Ray. Open it, Ray, will you please? But he wouldn't. He looked down at the envelope and watched his own fingertips as they traced the name on the surface of the paper. I watched with increasing frustration before snatching the envelope from him and tearing it open. I let the paper fall to the floor. It landed next to the wrapping paper. Angrily, I shoved the open card in his face. Read it, Ray. Read the birthday card, will you? He wouldn't even look at it. His eyes were fixed on the floor. He bent down and picked up the scraps of paper before turning around and walking through the kitchen into the bathroom, holding the torn envelope in one hand and the wrapping paper in the other. He closed the bathroom door behind him. I noticed there was another birthday card sitting on one of the bookshelves. I walked over, picked it up, and read it. It was from my mother and was addressed to Golden Boy. Although Ray was a grown man and had been for many years, she insisted on treating him as if he were still a child.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
Yeah, I find so interesting about this story is like if you think a bit about, I guess, the way that it's kind of plotted, it's like we have the desire of the brother to be acknowledged by his brother as a brother. And it never
Mm-hmm.
happens. It's like
Mm-hmm.
his younger brother doesn't recognize him as a brother, doesn't recognize him as family, or at least in any way that is meaningful or legible to him. But and his resentment, the older brother's resentment stems from the fact that he still feels obligated to his brother, despite the fact
Mm-hmm.
that his brother won't recognize him.
Mm-hmm.
And he has to go and visit him on his birthday because he'd feel terrible if he didn't. But when he gets there, his brother doesn't even acknowledge that it's his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like there's this tension. And as the story develops, um, there's this moment, right? It's like when he realizes that his younger brother takes the wrapping paper that the present was in, and it looks like he's about to recognize it as a gift, but actually all he wants is the paper so that he can take it into the bathtub, dip it in the water, and turn it into paper mache so he can make more cars.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gives the car to his brother, and his brother is like, "Oh my God, this is the moment I've been waiting for 15 years, where my brother will finally acknowledge me as his family." And he says, "I made this for you."
Mm-hmm.
Except the kind of, I guess, the kind of the big reveal of the story is that is that his brother is planning on giving those exact same cards to everyone who lives on the street and saying the exact
Mm-hmm.
same thing to every one of them, which is that I made this for you. So that
Mm-hmm.
it's so it's quite
Yeah.
ironic in a way. Like it's almost like a bit of a black comedy or something.
Well,
Um,
I think it's funny. I think it's a
yeah.
funny. I mean, I think even the most difficult stories I write, they're always this. They're funny, and I think your reading is entirely. I mean, it's entirely right. And for people, I mean, it doesn't matter to the extent of what is real. But again, part of it is based on the fact that my younger brother, who died,
Mm.
suffered a really debilitating psychiatric illness for about 40 years, from when he was about
Oh.
18 until his death, and he basically barely communicated with any of us for that time. Although yeah, my younger brother ate dinner at my mum's every night of his life from when he left home until the day he died, but often wouldn't even speak to anyone, and he didn't like me speaking to him. So when I would go to his place, he often, like, he wouldn't, he if I went to his house, and he lived very close by here, and knocked on his door, he would tell me he was busy and wouldn't let me in. So, I
Mm.
mean, it's clearly the frustration of that is evident in the relationship to a real life story. I suppose, of course, what's different, and as you would know, fiction, you can go anywhere you like with it.
Mm.
And I suppose, even though you're entirely right that he says, I made this for you, but he made this car for everyone, so his brother's not special in any way.
Oh.
Even still, there is something of, if anything, he's generous to everyone. While
Mm.
his brother may not be special, it is an act of generosity nonetheless. So that writing the story, I suppose I wanted to write a fictional character who was able to break out of that terrible solitude that my brother lived in. So I actually
Mm.
really, it's probably, I wrote the story a long time ago. I think, if I had to say, out of stories of mine that I loved writing and still feel really well proud of, it's one of my favorite stories.
Mm. It strikes me as quite poignant that that we're talking about two stories about your youngest brother. Are they both, in a way, they're both inspired by the same brother?
Yeah,
And at different points in his life, even though it's
yeah,
fictional, but it's inspired by your relationship to your brother.
yeah.
One that captures this very innocent moment is at the beginning of the characters' lives, and one that kind of refigures that relationship, 20 or so years later in a very different way. And also it very at the almost the beginning of your career and then towards your later writing. I mean, I've got nothing interesting to say about that except that it's quite moving. Yeah, here has a question here that says, oh, a comment. I think every story has a message the writer wants to convey.
Yeah,
Um,
that's from I don't know, I missed it. Was it Yahya? Yahya?
yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good comment question. And I think that if I could just address whether it's a question or a
Mm,
comment, because I think it's so important. The issue there is that I think that most writers have a preoccupation with a core idea or ideas that are always grounding your work, and you may
mm,
not always be aware of them. And I, some people might say I repeat ideas of mine.
mm,
More favorably, a friend of mine who died, a wonderful writer, Ross Gibson, he uses the word reiteration. You're going over the same territory because you're digging and digging and digging. And the deeper you dig, the more you're trying to discover something, but you never get to the bottom. Yeah, you're always digging. And I think a lot of my work, it is true. A writer is trying to convey something essential to their being, and you don't know, and sometimes you don't know what that is. So just as basically if someone said, well, what's this story about? I could claim to know what it's about and give you a synopsis of 2 minutes, but your reading of this story is more sophisticated than mine. And
mm,
that shows again that sometimes I think the thing I love here, often the reader will discover something for you in the story. That's why I feel always indebted to readers, that you learn so much about what you're trying to do through the reader. So I think that in all the stories where I've written about siblings, and all of my novels have by the way, every one of my novels has a 13-year-old in it. And it's
mm,
not like at the start, I don't think I'm going to do another 13-year-old character. They just land there. There's clearly something I'm trying to convey other than the story about what it is about siblings. So I'm really fascinated about the loyalty, the care, the
mm,
protection that siblings give each other. And I think if I were to hazard a guess, I grew up in a very dangerous world, both in
mm,
my own home with my father, who was an extremely violent person, and aspects of my life. But I had really protective forces around me in relationship to my sister and my older brother. And I think it's about what children are able to do to try and keep the world at bay. I think
mm.
that's important.
Yeah, wow. I was gonna say, it kind of brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you about narration, because we have these two first-person narrators between the Bicycle Thieves and Gifted, and it's interesting to hear that they're in a way channeling or connecting to a particular line of your history and your biography. But it's like some people say that every first person narrator has a reason for speaking. And that's
Mm,
like what's different between first person and third person. In third person, the story is told by a narrator who's from outside of the world looking in. And so they don't
mhm,
actually need a reason to motivate the telling of that story, right? It's almost artificial. It's like the story is speaking. But with first person, there's a character who's lived that life and is coming back for some reason at this point to retell it, to retell that experience. And so they have something to say. And it's kind of interesting. It's like his comment is about, well, the writer has a story they're trying to tell, or like a message in the story, but also the character has a message.
mm,
I was
mm.
wondering what you think these two different characters, like I guess, why it is that they're speaking now at this point, and what it is that they might be trying to say or be trying to do by telling these stories.
Well, I think in the case of first person, when I begin a first person story or in a novel, but I think the novels is the weird. I've done 5 novels. I think that only the first novel, Blood, is first person from memory. Yeah, it is. So all the others are third
Mm,
person. I think with first person, firstly, if just to think technically, I like the intimacy of voice. So I like to get that voice. Not that you can't get that in a third person narrator, you certainly
mm,
can. But the intimacy of getting that voice right is really important. But your second point was more, I think, more vital in the sense that I think clearly in these first person stories, the narrator, the older brother in this story, he's trying to redeem himself for his sense of guilt over his brother or
mm,
neglect of his brother. And even though it's quite abrasive, their relationship, I think the overall motivation and or the psychological motivation for me as the writer would be trying to redeem myself in relationship to my relationship with my younger brother, which I
Mm,
often felt a great deal of guilt over, which I don't
mm,
think I should. But I think when you see your brother or someone in your family go through a very terrible, debilitating mental breakdown, it would be hard not to feel guilty about that because I've spent my life very puzzled about what caused it. And I still, I don't know what caused it. I think about why did I not understand what was happening at the time, even though I was only a teenager myself. So I think
mm,
part of it is about, yeah, when you go back to the bicycle thief story about the innocence, I think that any story that I've written about a version of a younger sibling, the younger sibling, and it might seem obvious, but the younger sibling in my stories is always innocent and naive and needs to be protected by an older sibling. And I think in my case, I'm probably both part of those characters. I resemble, or my childhood resembles, the naivety of a younger character being protected by an older character. But as an adult, I think I also want to be the protector. I want to show that so yeah, that bicycle thief, someone wrote, and I like it, that it's also a bit like a Western. Yeah, the older brother, it's like
mm,
Shane, the Western movie Shane, although he gets beaten up. It's about the brother going out into the Badlands to confront these outlaws and coming back beaten up but proud of himself. So it's a bit like
mm,
the being heroic. I'd have to admit to wanting to be heroic.
mm. Yeah, there's something almost tragic in a way about the way that about the bicycle thieves, the narrator of that story. It's like he's wanting to tell us about the time that he protected his brother, the time that he was the hero, that he did everything right for his brother. And it's hard not to see that story as trying to prove something to himself later in his life. It's like
Yeah,
looking
of
back at this
course,
time that he was good, you know? And
of
that
course.
and I can yeah, and I find that I guess maybe for some of the writers in the room, it's like I think if there's sort of a lesson there, it's something about like, hearing about as writers, it's like we have these questions that are driving us and these
Yeah,
problems in our lives that we're always trying to figure out. And it's like using fiction as a vehicle for exploring those, but doing it, it's interesting the way that it always maps really cleanly onto a plot for you, Tony.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I love plot. You know that. My students thought I was an old-fashioned, sort of social realist just because I love plot.
mm.
Just to we should maybe move on to the next story. We could maybe give the free exercise at the end. Just for people, I've got the chat open. So if people have questions now, put them in the chat and Nick and I will answer them as we go. But do you want to go on to the next story?
Absolutely. So what I was thinking we should talk about, well, actually, Tony, maybe before we do that, just very quickly, because the exercise that we're going to focus on for those
Yeah,
two is about objects, right? And
yeah,
about using an object to begin a story. Because they
yeah,
both, one is you've got the bicycle for the first one, and then you've got the little model cars for the second story, Gifted. Is there anything
yeah.
that you want to say about objects as a kind of
Yes.
engine
So
for writing for you?
yes.
Like why do they keep coming back for you when you're writing?
Well, and I think that people, and I don't want to be presumptuous here, so please forgive me. I'm not being patronizing, but one of the things I do know what has happened in Gaza is that we see people on the move, tragically having to move, people
Mm,
carrying their worldly possessions. I've seen them on backs of trucks, on bicycles, to think about what it is that people take with them. And I think people often choose things of utility, like a cooking pot. It has utility. You can cook in it. But I'm sure often when people look at that cooking pot, that's a cooking pot that they've used all their life, that maybe their mother had, their grandmother, and it has a story as well as its utility. So I'm interested in the way that objects carry stories. So I have so many objects here, so I can literally, without getting up, um, so you can see this one. So this used to,
mm.
to belong to my brother. I have this beautiful wooden egg that I bought home from Japan, and like this cost about $3. in
Mm,
Australian money. But as soon as I picked it up and held it in my hand, it had a real sort of beautiful quality. So when I play with it, I I think about that time. I have this. Have a look at this.
mm,
This is wonderful. This is a gift. So I have these things around me that when I'm writing, they all carry stories. So I think to think about it is that objects hold stories about ourselves and our family. And that I think often when I'm thinking about story making, it's rare that I would write a story where an object didn't have an important place, even if it may seem subtle. So, I feel that, spatially around me, there are so many things that remind me of my history. I mean, I've got an old milk bottle up here, which I won't get down, which was a dairy that used to be at the end of my street 60 years ago when they had local dairies. Yeah, they don't have them anymore. And I found the milk bottle with the address of that dairy. And I remember going past that dairy every morning when I was going to school. So when I pick up that milk bottle, I think of it. Now, that's what happens to you just in the world, but it also means that often these objects you create a fiction with them. You can create a fictional story with them. So if I were to say to do an exercise, my what I would say to people, think about an object that is precious to you, and often these objects
mm,
have no real material value, so they're not diamond rings or things
mm,
that you can pawn or sell. They're often things
mm,
that may seem of little consequence, but if you have to move, like you had to move house, you have to go somewhere and you're gathering the goods around you that are precious, people will always choose things that carry important stories of family, of their history. So it's about how an object really holds, it's like an archive of your life, it's like a history of your
mm,
life. And what I do as a writer is I try to conjure stories out of those archives.
mm. Yeah, fantastic. Well, does anyone have anything they want to, is there any questions they want to ask
Hang
about
on.
these two stories before we move on? Go on, Tony.
I've got a
Oh,
question
yeah,
here from Ruba Khalid. Um,
yeah.
when you want to make that connection between characters and the audience, do you make that consciously? Great question. Like, do you
Mm,
have specific steps to build that connection, or is it built as the story continues? So, Ruba, that is
mm,
another brilliant question, and I can answer that. I've sort of get these questions occasionally. So, the first one would be to say, when I'm writing a story, I don't think consciously at the time of writing about audience or how it will be read is the best way to answer that. What I think about is how it be true to the story, making the story, and how does it work within the story? And I'm not conscious of a reader. So, in the sense of Ruber asking then about the specific steps that I would take, it's about the connection between the elements of the story. But Ruber, there's another really important thing that you're alluding to in the question. What I do is when I write, or even after, I have real belief in my readers. So I believe as a reader, I'm a generous reader. So when I buy a book or read a story, I want it to work, obviously. So I want the writer to write well. I want to enjoy the work. I don't want to be a critic and tell everyone how shit it was, how bad it was. I really want to enjoy the work. And I'm a generous reader in that sense. I really barrack for the writer. I cheer for the
mm,
writer. And if the story fails, I feel disappointed for the writer. I don't think, oh, I'm not critical of the writer. I feel disappointed because someone tried to make something for me. Someone, did their best. So what I think about Ruber is that when I finish the story, I hope that the readers who read my work do come to it with a sense of generosity. And I hope that my generosity as a writer is met by their generosity. And together we make something. I was saying this to a friend the other day. One of the relationship between a writer and reader is so important, but it's
mm,
weird because this is where I write, where I'm sitting now. I do my writing in solitude. I do it on my own. I don't share my work with anyone before it's finished. So I do this thing on my own. Then a reader one day picks up a book of mine and they read on their own, in bed, on the tram, sitting in the park. So we're both doing this thing in a solitary fashion, but we're intimately connected at the same time. So I love that. I really love that. So hang on. I know Ahmed has a question before mine, but I'd like to leave you with one question. Do the psychological motivations of your writing sometimes make the writing process challenging? Okay,
mm,
George. Yeah, so um, if it is challenging, but challenging in an enjoyable way, if I could put it that way. So if we're talking about the stories tonight, and say if we're talking about the difficulty or the challenge of writing fiction, in this case about a real life brother who passed away, yes, it is challenging, but not in a debilitating way. I actually feel that I enjoy that psychological motivation, as George has put it, and I enjoy that challenge. So again, for me, it's one of the beauties of being a writer is the enjoyment of being able to take that challenge and hopefully produce something that the reader values. But Ahmed,
Mm.
did you have a question? Apparently, it says here,
Oh yes,
that,
thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it. And honestly, it is always wonderful to hear the story from the writer himself. And this is how we've felt today. That's to hear the writer of the story read the story. It's a unique experience. Um, but I just wanted to ask about that theme of sibling loyalty and loss at the same time, because
Mm.
I think our students would relate to this, the theme of loss and how loss of loved ones may influence our way of writing, our way of
Mhm,
narrative, our thoughts. When you talked about Wayne and losing Wayne and how it impacted you in your writing and in your way of narrating, um, and I'm sure this relates to so many of us, to perhaps every one of us. We had lost so many ones over
mm,
the past 2 years. I know because I work with my students closely on a daily basis in terms of writing, in terms of sharing stories, in terms of sharing poetry. Much of what we've been doing is probably dedicated to our loved ones, to homes, to homeland, to belongings, to objects. You talked about objects, and we may touch upon this in a bit. But how do you think, like in Bicycle Thieves and then in Gifted, do you think that writing those stories was one way of processing that loss of Wayne, or even loss in the wider concept? Because this might apply to the audience today, that, well, we encourage them to share their stories, to write, to document their stories. But do you think it helps in healing and processing loss? This is my first question. My second question was about object. And honestly, when you talked about those objects that remind you of stories, this reminded me of that experience of displacement that we all had in Gaza few months ago and over the past 2 years. When people were moving from one place to another, being displaced, leaving their homes, being forced to leave. And as you said, people were collecting things that they wanted to use
mm,
for their survival, like a cooking pot or whatever, or water tank, or toilet seat sometimes.
mm,
But even if it is trivial thing, as seen by so many, but that trivial thing may tell a story. It may remind the person, the owner of a story, and
mhm.
it feels like um, yeah, what you said, it doesn't have to be precious in terms of cost. It could be just as a gift that reminds you of a story in your history. Um,
Mhm,
how
mhm.
would you recommend embarking on incorporating that object in the story? Does it have to be in the beginning or in the middle of the story, in the peak, or it should run through the whole story? The whole story should
Yeah,
revolving around that small object. That was
yeah.
thank you so
I'll
much.
answer both of those, and then I've got a question here from Shahed. I think
Mm.
Shahed. Um, just for on the first issue, I think that one is now, and I want to say this again. I don't want to be presumptuous here because I have no I just have no concept of what people have had to deal with in Gaza and can't even begin to consider that. Yeah, like everyone else, I've got Palestinian friends in Melbourne. I've seen, shocking. I've read as much as I can and tried to learn as much as I can. looked at shocking coverage in the media, and because I have small grandchildren, I just can't understand. You know, I can't even begin to know how you would deal with that. But I have to say, on that basis, we can't be too well. If we generalize at all, is to say that yes, I found it very helpful and healing to write those stories about my brother. I'm not saying that everyone does. So sometimes, I mean, you'll get a question from people, "Oh, did you find it very upsetting to revisit that trauma?" I have to say, when I'm writing about that, my brother, or when I'm writing even about domestic violence against women, I don't feel traumatized. I feel that I can understand how a story can work to do something of value. So I find the writing process itself quite valuable. The stories that I've written about my brother, I did feel at the end of it that there was something very meditative in doing it, the work. So that I would say, yes, in my case, the stories that I published about, which were based on my brother who passed away, were very, very healing. But also, it's not enough if you're a published writer. The stories, I think they were very good stories in regard to my stories that I write. So I was actually also proud of the quality of the work. That really mattered to me to write really well. In regard to objects, there's not again a definitive answer. It's to think about an object the same way you would think about a character. So you may have a character in a story who dominates the story as either a narrator or a protagonist, or you might have a character who only appears briefly in a story, but their brief entry into story is really vital. So I just near me here, I have a huge collection of what's called beach glass. Scraps of glass that come up on the beach. It's glass that has been beautifully sanded, and all the sharpness is taken away, and they're like little diamonds. I collect those as well. I published a story called Refuge of Sinners, which is also in this book, and that scene with the beach glass is only 2 pages of a story, sort of in the middle. And it's just when a father who is thinking about bereavement of a lost son, he drops a glass jar of beach glass and it shatters all over the floor. And as he picks it up, he tries to remember which one of his children picked each piece of glass from the beach. So in that case, it's not really a key element of the story, but it's absolutely vital. So I think it's the best way I can answer that. Just again to Shahid's point, just on the first point, I think there's a really important comment here about how do we know that our main ideas are understandable by the readers or to the readers? And do you have advice for knowing that the idea makes sense, you need to convey? I'll just say to Shahid, unfortunately, we don't know. We can never be sure. So it is weird to be a writer. Again, Shahid, think about when you're writing the story, I don't think about the reader. Obviously, when I've done a full first draft, then I will think, well, does that make sense? Does that sit where it should? Would a reader follow the story that way? So yes, I do begin to do that. But Shahid, one of the things we suffer as writers, and one of the beauty is you can never second guess what a reader will think. And hopefully you get more readers who think favorably than unfavorably. So I think, Shahid, what I wouldn't do, I wouldn't concentrate too much on what you think a reader will think or how you think a story will be received, because if you do that, I think you suffer the problem of your writing becoming maybe prescriptive, and you're trying to, in a way, sort of say to the reader, do you get it now? Do you get it now? So you put too much emphasis on it. So trust your reader, and trust the quality of the writing. And Shahid then says, I think writing process itself considered as a healing process, which helps us as writers to overwhelm what we have lived. Okay, so I think Shahid's making a really good point about, and I hopefully I got this right, Shahid, is that I think Shahid's saying that the process of writing itself is really important to us to overcome those difficulties that we've had and we've experienced. So yes, I think in that case for me, writing itself is a very healing process. Nick, I'm a bit conscious of time. Whether we have time to look at the third story or not, I'll leave that up to Ahmed. I'm happy to, but I don't know how Ahmed feels about that.
I mean, we're happy to move to the third story if you still have time. I mean, yeah.
Well, I have time. Nick,
Yeah,
do you
that's
want
fine.
to do that, Nick?
I think it would be a great idea.
Yeah.
We've got there were two stories we thought about we looking at. One of them was China, and the other one was Paper Moon. But because that writing exercise for China, Tony, is about loss, um, it kind of I feel like we've covered that pretty fulsomely, I feel like. So maybe we should talk about Paper Moon instead.
Yeah. So do you want me to do a synopsis or do you want to do it?
No, it'd be great if you could, I think. And it's a we're going to talk about Paper Moon. I thought maybe you might want to read a little bit of that as well, if you're able to.
Have you got a page?
Um, yeah, 242 to 245, Tony, if you would be so kind.
And
Um,
just for people, just to remind you, this will be the last story. So if you've got another question or a comment,
mm,
the chat now, and we'll make sure we get to it before we finish. Okay, so this is a story about a girl who goes to visit a young girl who goes to visit her father in a psychiatric institution. Carol's father was sitting on a wooden bench in the far corner of the gymnasium. He wore pajamas, the top buttoned to the neck. The room was littered with exercise equipment, barbells, stationary bikes, a rowing machine, and several large plastic balls. A young man wearing an open gown and floral boxer shorts skipped along on one side of the room, skillfully dribbling a soccer ball. Carol's mother paused, released Carol's hand, and straightened her dress. She gritted her teeth, smiled, and walked over to her husband. She kissed him on the forehead and touched the back of her gloved hand to his neck. Carol studied her father's face closely as she approached. He was wearing a new hairstyle. The sides of his head were shaven and a fringe sat across his eyes. He looked up at Carol, fixed on her in a moment of recognition, and turned quickly away, his cheeks flushed. Say hello to your father, Carol's mother said, coaxing her forward. Look, Paul, I've brought Carol to see you. He focused on Carol a second time, smiled, but said nothing. Come on, Carol, her mother urged. Sit here by your father. She tried clicking her fingers together. The gloved fingers silenced the action. She has some sweets for you, Paul. Carol was nervous. She placed the box of minties in her father's lap. They fell. The three of them looked down at the floor. The young man dribbling the ball weaved it between Carol's left foot and the minties. Carol picked up the packet and held it in front of her father. It's for you, Daddy, she whispered. He took them and picked at the cellophane wrapper of the packet, one hand shaking slightly. They sat together in silence, watching the young man lap the room. One of the other patients began to applaud. Carol's father handed the minties back to her and brought his hands together as if he was about to applaud also. Instead, he crossed his arms over his heart and stuck a hand under each armpit. Carol's mother nervously jumped from the bench. Let's go outside. Come on, the three of us. The air is so still in here. I need to get some fresh air.
thank you, Tony. So, I mean, just to finish off the synopsis, Carol is going to help her father, well, she's going to try and help her father escape the institution that he's in, and it's quite anticlimactic in a way, isn't it, Tony? And that they just kind of walk out of the institution, and she just gets on the bus with her father, and the story finishes with them just waiting to see what will happen.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I look, the end is quite purposeful. And the story is not really, well, the story is not really about whether they escape or not. It's about
mm,
the tenderness that the girl conveys to her father. And again, there are things in this story that it's interesting about what readers are given and what they're not given. Um, this story revisits a story from my first book called The Haircut, when an adult man, and that is my most autobiographical book, gives his father a haircut in a psychiatric institution. And it's the end of a collection of stories called Shadowboxing, where the father figure is a pretty unsavory character. And I think what I did in this story, and I'm sure of this, it was a story about my father in some odd way, that I wanted to revisit the memory of my father being in psychiatric care, but the child of the father in this fictional story being obviously a child who loves her father deeply, shows her father,
Yeah.
and her father is he's saddened by what he's experienced, but he's also been a very, very good father. So it was in a way a story that, yeah, the reader wouldn't know this if they hadn't read my first book, but it is a story that almost revisits not the same scene, but the same issue very closely.
Mm. It's interesting that we were talking before about like really framing those two other stories as first person stories, you know, about a character who has something they have to say and something they need to explore. But this story is in third person, obviously.
Hmm.
And I was wondering why it was you chose to tell this particular story in third person, because I feel like that's such a big issue that students have or kind of um, you know, students of writing. It's like which point of view to choose, what's the best point of view for each story. And it's like, yeah, I thought maybe you could tell us a bit about your process.
Well, the process for this and for third person is that one of the reasons that third person works best in this story is that, I mean, I could have written it from the perspective of the child who's about 8, and I write child characters well, I think,
Mm,
but it would have been limiting in some way. I mean, it could have been more intimate in some ways, but by writing this story in third person, we get a perspective of motivation that Carol herself is probably not aware of. So
mm,
the third person in this case gives you an awareness of behavior and motivation that would be very difficult to convey in a first person story. So I think one of the things about third person, it does allow you to in a way put the lens on a character that in a way that you couldn't do or you wouldn't do as a first person narration. Um, Now, I have to say that when I'm doing this, I I tend to be a writer who has an innate sense of what's going to be best for a story before I've written. So sometimes I used to advise students if you're not sure about first or third person, try a couple of paragraphs in first, try a couple of paragraphs in third. I tend not to do that. I tend to know once I've started where it's going to go.
mm,
So in this case, I just think it was a better way of getting insight into the psychological motivation of the child that she couldn't convey through her own, yeah, through a first person
mm.
experience.
Yeah, it strikes me about that yeah, that is the strength of the story. And I guess that is the strength of third person, right? That you're able to kind of use the technique of focalization to sort of go inside the mind of a character and see
Hmm.
things from their point of view. And it's almost like kind of dredging up the consciousness of the character or their thought process and bringing it to the surface of the writing so that the reader gets to see how they think without them
Hmm.
realizing that they're doing that, you know?
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
and it allows you in a way, and look, I guess like James Joyce's Dubliners or something might be like the classic
Hmm.
example of this way of writing where you enter a character's mind, you watch them through a day of their life, and then you
Hmm.
leave. You know, it's like you come in and you get to and the story leaves. And then
Hmm.
the intensity of it for the reader is that feeling of leaving these characters behind at the end and not knowing what's going to happen, as if you
Hmm.
just kind of swoop in and swoop out. And
Hmm.
that seems to be a very effective way of telling this story. Because as you
Yeah.
said, the point isn't whether they escape or not. And in a way, it's like we sort of get that as a reader because of the way that the story is told and because it's in third person and it has that snapshot feeling. Do you is there anything you want to tell us about the process of using that technique of focalization, of going inside a character's mind and using that to structure the story? Because it's a very hard technique, and I feel like as a student of writing, I always found it really hard, and I would labor over all the decisions I made. And there's something very effortless about the way that you do it with this child's mind.
Yeah. Well, I think that again, so it might seem like a contradiction. Once I start to write a story, I write fairly quickly.
Mm,
Particularly short stories, in the sense that if I'm writing a novel, so I've written 5 novels, I write relatively quickly, but I have to do a lot of editing and reworking. So,
mm,
and I'm quite happy to know that if I do my first draft and I know there's a lot of tidying up to do. I accept that. One of the things when I'm writing a short story, I tend not to have a lot of cleaning up to do. I write
Mm,
it fairly clean, but I think to answer the question, when I write a short story, I do a lot of, it might seem odd, I do a lot of thinking about the story before I start. So by the time
mm,
I've started, the sort of questions you're asking, Nick, it's not that I haven't dealt with them. I have dealt with them a lot, but I haven't dealt with them in the writing. So by the time I
mm,
get to sit down at the desk, I've done a lot of thinking work. I might have taken some notes, and I'm pretty confident about what I'm going to do. The other thing to remember when I write um, third person, I do it might seem odd, but I do imagine the third person as a character. So as
mm,
a really the tone, so the tone and the pace of a third person voice is really important to me. So this is a great example. So I think even though the different stories, even if you take a story like this with Gifted, there is a tenderness, even though there's that
mm,
abrasive sense of the brother. To me, this is a really tender story, so that when I'm thinking of the narrator's voice as third person, it's even though it's sort of a neutralized voice in some way, you do want to encapsulate the tenderness in the story. And just for reference sake, I think it's very evident in my novel, The White Girl, that it's about an Aboriginal matriarch caring for her granddaughter, and that third person voice was written in a way to convey the tenderness. And the other thing, by the way, Nick, I think is relative here, is that when you say getting inside the character's head, the other thing that I'm very interested in is also getting inside their bodies, which is different.
mm,
And what I mean
mm,
by that, if you take when she guides her father by the hand, there is the physical touch that takes place. The physicality in my characters is probably as important as anything I do. So when I imagine a scene, or when I'm, yeah, for want of a better term, choreographing a scene in my head, I
mm,
actually do see the characters interacting physically. And it's one of the most important things I do in my writing is no one speaks without movement. And when I imagine two characters speaking, I see them like my hands are all over the place. So I'm a very physical person in that way, so that I can't keep still. Um, and that my way of speaking, it's linked to the physicality of my body, so that in all of my stories, I think you get insights into the character's emotional state by what they do physically.
mm. Yeah, that's the thing. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I'm just remembering, Tony, from 10 years ago, the lesson that you did in one of your classes specifically on blocking dialogue. And I took
Mhm.
all of I always do that now. It's like it's such an important thing to remind yourself of as a writer. Is like, where are my characters right
Mm.
now, spatially?
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
find that even in the parts, even in the moments in your fiction where characters go back in time to retell just like a little snippet of something that happened, there's always still a sense of where those characters were in space, even if we just get like a fraction.
yeah.
I think that's a really good lesson. The other thing I was going to say is just for people who are either listening to this after the fact or in the room now, one really, I think, really great exercise that you can do, like a reading exercise to get you ready for writing a third person story, is paying attention in Paper Moon to the segues, those moments where the subject matter changes. Because I
Hmm.
find that very hard for in third person writing. Because with first person writing, the narrator just gets to do whatever they like. They can go back in time if they want. They could be like, I'm going to talk about this, now I'm going to talk about this other thing. And we know what it's like to talk to someone, and we get the sense that speech is its own motivation. But with third person, you don't have that as much. So you have to justify the movement from one subject to another or from one period of time to another by something within the story. And usually it's an interiority thing, something the character is thinking, which links to another idea. But there are a few different ways you do it in Paper Moon, that you move from one theme or one idea to another. And it would be a cool exercise to mark those down, I think, as a student and try to figure out how you did it.
Well, I
Um,
don't know. The problem here, right, or the challenge here is, I'll say that to the people in the room.
mm,
The first thing I'd say to you is that anything that I suggest or that Nick suggests or anyone else suggests, the first thing is to respond to that generously. So if someone gives you an idea for how they approach a piece of writing or how you might do a lesson, I think
mm,
you should take up that challenge, take up that offer generously, but you don't buy it automatically. So in other words, I've heard writers say, "Oh, look, this is how I did this," and I think, "What? I could
mm,
never do that, or I wouldn't want to do that." So it's about giving an idea time, but sometimes you think, "No, it doesn't work for me." And the other thing is that,
mm,
and it might sound odd, some of the ways that you work that might become your signature or something that that you're known for stylistically or structurally, sometimes you don't know how you did it anyway. So
mm,
I, I'm not that self-conscious about some of the ways I work anyway. And I think it's just the way that you develop as right. Now, just before, because I think we're gonna have to finish soon.
yeah, we do. We got to finish.
Did we have a exercise with this story?
We did. And I just thought I would share screen it now so we can look at some of these exercises. Um,
Oh,
yeah, so I put them here on a slide so that for people who are at home or anyone who comes back to look at it later, they can screenshot this and use them to kind of, yeah, come up with some writing in
mm,
conversation with the stories, which is, as every writer knows, is a great way to write, right? Like writing in conversation with someone else's work. And
yeah.
for this one, it was think about a person you love, a sibling, a parent, a cousin, an uncle, an auntie, a grandparent, and think about a moment in your life with that person and write that story.
Yeah. So I think it's a good one to focus on because if you look at it, you think, well, yeah, you think about someone you love and tell a story about them. That's not an exercise, that's what you do. But it is. It is. So there's a key word here, and it's think about a moment. And
Mm,
I'm really convinced by this that yes, there are people in my life that I love dearly that I could write a sort of mini life story, or I could write I could write a love letter about my grandmother who I was very close to. But when it says think about a moment, what I'm saying here is to try and think about a moment that encompasses that person, that gives us an insight into that person's character, an insight into
mm,
that person's values, and an insight, of course, into what it is, not that you love them, but something that indicates how you love them or how love is played out, how love is experienced. So, in other words, it's not telling us, I love my grandmother. It's about, so just off the top of my head, if I were to write a letter to my grandmother, Alma,
mm,
I would probably write a story about just the trips that my grandmother and I used to make to secondhand shops, to op shops, as we call them in Australia, when I was a kid. So every Friday, my grandmother, we would have this excursion, this holiday where we would go to shops and we would, they'd have secondhand jumpers and secondhand books and secondhand comics. And she would always allow me to buy because I love woolen jumpers. So she would say, yeah, you want to pick a jumper for yourself, or do you want to buy a comic book for yourself? And yeah, these comic books would cost like a penny or something. Even today, they wouldn't cost much. But that act of generosity and going home with my grandmother and reading the comic book while she made a cup of tea, or if it was winter, putting on this secondhand jumper and feeling so sort of warm and secure. So I would write a story about a day out with my grandmother, and I wouldn't say in the story, this is how much I love my grandmother. Because if I write that story well, the reader, of course, would say, "Oh, wow, this grandmother loves her son and the boy and her grandson, and he loves." So it's about finding that moment that encompasses what it might say about what you share with that person in your life, an experience that holds you and that person, sort of, like what I call a heart story, I suppose I call them. Yeah.
mm. Well, I guess we sort of pretty much have to finish up now, right, Armin? Tony, did you wanna talk us through the exercise for China? Even though we didn't get a chance to talk about it, I mean, everyone, maybe some people in the room have read it, or some people who are watching this video later will have read it.
Yeah. I'll just so just Yahya, Yahya. has asked, sorry, to comment. I think there should be
Oh, okay.
figurative language imagery when writing a story. I can only say I agree with that. And Ahmed, another one. What is the recommended length of a short story? Sorry, Ahmed, it's the old piece of string. My stories tend to come in at around 3,000 words because that's usually the absolute length that a writing competition will allow a story in Australia. I think look, the stories as long as it needs to be. I think what we often would regard as a short story, the shortest short stories might be, 1,000 words, 1,500 words. Often short stories, if there was an average length, I think, about 3,000 words is a sort of average. But I've tended to write longer short stories, Ahmed, as I've written more. So it's the story needs to be as long as it needs to be, and only the writer can really understand this. And Rima, after we do the exercise, where can we send it so we can get feedback? So Nick has put his email there, but Nick, I'm quite happy for you to share my university email as well.
Yeah, cool. I was just about to ask you that. I'll put it in right
So
now.
put that in the chat. So Rima and anyone else, if you want to send us any responses to the exercises, both Nick and I. And if we get a few of them, Nick and I, we can maybe have coffee and go over them and give some shared feedback. Nick is a much harsher judge than me. I think he's a much more serious teacher. I'm what's called a bad reader. I love everything I read. So if you want to get positive feedback, send it to me.
That's true. Yeah, I remember you saying, Tony, there was never a story that you read from a student in whatever your 20 years of teaching that you didn't find one thing about it that you really liked.
Well, I'll be completely honest, even if so sometimes, if a student hadn't written well, I wouldn't say you haven't written well. If I ever said, oh, where did this idea come from? The student hadn't written well. But the point is, anytime a student talked about what they wanted the story to be, this, synopsis, an idea,
Mm.
I never heard of about every time. I
Mm.
think that, and I would say to the student, that is a fantastic idea for a story. Now let's make sure we can do justice to the idea and write as well as we can. So my point is, I do believe that when you come up with an idea for a short story, hypothetically, any story can be written. It's can you do it? And sometimes, and for people again in the room, sometimes you can't do it. And I'm not talking about me. Sometimes I've had ideas for a story and I've got frustrated
Mm.
that I just haven't been able to do it. And you know, that's just comes with the turf. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Today was not a good day to write.
I
To
always
paraphrase.
think it takes, I was gonna say, I always think it takes like about 2 years from the point of me getting an idea to me figuring out how to write that idea and then me drafting something I like and getting it out into the world. It's like a 2 year timeline from the moment the idea strikes. It just sits there, just percolating.
That means, Nick, in 20 years' time, you'll have a collection.
That's right, Tony. That's exactly what I'm working towards. I'll invite
Now,
you. I got 10 more years to go.
uh, hang on, for people left in the room, don't listen to Nick. Listen to Uncle Tony. You do not need 2 years to write a story, Nick.
That's true.
I'll
No, Tony's right. It's pretty much the
I'm
most, yeah, the most
just
esteemed thing about me is that I am
yeah.
Tony's student. So
Look, I
that's, you
think
should
we
follow
we
Tony's
should
advice.
hand back. We should hand back to Ahmed, I think, to
I agree.
finish. But I can't let that go without saying, Nick, you need to talk to me, Nick. You need help. Okay, so let's get back to Ahmed to finish us off.
Wow, what a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Tony and Nick. We really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the students have enjoyed it. And those who will watch the recording will really enjoy it. Really informative and useful. And I'll be sharing the link to this recording with you, Nick and Tony. Thank you so much for your time today. And would love to have you again in the future. Hopefully by then, some of our students will have stories that they could share with us, read their stories, or they had published some of their stories or writing. So thank you so much, Tony. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And
Yeah, if I can just to
sure.
finish, firstly, I will come back anytime if I can do anything for your students. Um, with Nick. I'll come back with Nick if he behaves himself. Um, it's such a pleasure to do this. And so anytime you want to do this or want to do something else, we could do an actual workshop, a writing
Mm,
workshop, which I do often. So I'd be happy to do that anytime that suits you. And please, for any of the students in the audience tonight, but also when you share the recording, we're quite serious. Please send us your
mm,
responses to the exercise or anything else you do. And Nick and I will make sure that we give you feedback. But I just want to thank everyone for inviting me. And again, Nick is a bit of my whipping boy, but he's a wonderful young person, very passionate, very committed. And if Nick hadn't organised this, I wouldn't have been able to come along. So I want to thank Nick a lot because I know there are many writers that he could ask in Melbourne who he knows, and I don't know if I'm sure that he thought of me first. I really think that he's really reached out to me, and I feel very privileged that Nick invited me. But to share tonight with all of you, I feel very lucky. So, and of
mm.
course, I want everyone to take care and. I hope things change for you and change is important.
Oh, thank you. This is really heartwarming to hear. Thank you so much, Tony. And of course, we are also proud of Nick. We had a wonderful session with him a few weeks ago. So yeah, we are also proud of him as you are proud of.
Um,
So would love to have you again, Nick, soon, hopefully.
Yeah,
we would
I hope he
go on.
just gets. I hope he learns to write a bit quicker. That's the only thing. Imagine if he was doing a novel.
Yeah, all right. Well, what I will say is that we would love absolutely to very seriously receive any work from anyone who watches this video, but also it'd be wonderful to do a workshop in the future. It would be great even to receive some writing beforehand that me and Tony could get together and give some feedback to it and think about how we could host a workshop and do it
Yeah,
asynchronously so everyone can
yeah,
be involved.
yeah. So Ahmed,
Oh,
it's really up to you, Ahmed, to just um, whatever you think is best for you and your students, we'll
sure.
do. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, we also come very cheap. I usually charge a cake. You can't even do that, yeah. So when I do workshops over here, I tell them there's a cake in Australia called a lamington,
mm,
and I say if I can have a lamington with fresh cream, I'll come and do it.
mm. I could probably arrange a Lamington for Tony, but it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege, and I have all the time in the world when it comes to this particular space and doing everything I can for your students and everyone in the room, Ahmed. It really means so much to be able to take some time out of my week and think about how to do this as best as I possibly can. So it means a lot.
Oh, this leaves us speechless. Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate
Uh,
it. And we look
Thank you,
forward to
everyone.
having you again. Thank you. And have a good night. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, everyone, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, guys. It's lovely
Bye.
to see you all again. Bye bye.
Bye. Salam.
Bye.
Bye.